The first shell punched through the Panzer 3 at 0632 hours. No warning. No muzzle flash they'd seen in time. Just the crack of a 6-pounder and the wet crunch of steel failing. The tank brewed up 40 meters, about 130 feet, from the British line. The crew never got out, and 500 guns were waiting for the rest, dug in, camouflaged, silent, covering 8 kilometers, roughly 5 miles of Tunisian scrubland, every approach route, every fold in the ground, and every piece of cover a retreating tank might use. 500 guns, and not one of them had fired yet. 3 Panzer divisions were driving straight into the killing ground. The British knew they were coming. They knew the day. They knew the direction. They knew the divisions. They'd known for 72 hours. This is Medenine. March 6th, 1943. The battle that finished what Snipe started and ended Erwin Rommel's war in the desert forever. 5 months ago, 19 guns and 300 men destroyed 52 of Rommel's Panzers at a place called Outpost Snipe. We covered it. It should have been the end. Rommel's armor shattered, his offensive capability broken against a single British position held by the 2nd Rifle Brigade. But the Desert Fox didn't die at Snipe. He rebuilt. He pulled back. He planned one final strike. And this time, Montgomery knew exactly when it was coming. 72 hours earlier, that the decrypt had landed on Bernard Montgomery's desk. Ultra, the product of British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, who had cracked the German Enigma machine and were reading German operational traffic in near real time. This particular decrypt was specific. March 6th, 3 Panzer divisions, 140 tanks, axis of advance northwest to southeast, straight through the British positions at Medenine. Montgomery didn't have Rommel's plan in rough outline. He had it in detail, before Rommel's own field commanders did. The question wasn't whether the attack was coming. The question was what to do with 72 hours. To understand why those hours mattered, you need to understand how desperate Rommel was. By March 1943, the Afrika Korps was caught between 2 armies. Montgomery's 8th Army from the east, Eisenhower's forces from the west after the torch landings. Tunisia was the last Axis territory in Africa, and it was shrinking by the day. Rommel knew the math. He'd known it since October, since Montgomery's artillery had shattered his lines at Alamein, and the long retreat had begun. Every tank destroyed, every truck burned, every experienced crew killed or captured. Gone. The Allies shipped fresh equipment across the Atlantic faster than the Afrika Korps could count it. The numbers didn't work. Everyone knew it. Operation Capri was Rommel's last card, a spoiling attack. Hit Montgomery before he was ready, I shatter the forward positions. Buy time. It was vintage Rommel. Speed, aggression, shock. It had worked at Gazala. It had worked at Kasserine Pass against the Americans just weeks before. But if you saw what happened at Snipe, you already know the lesson Montgomery had learned. Properly positioned anti-tank guns could gut an armored assault. 19 guns, 52 Panzers. Lieutenant Colonel Vic Turner won the Victoria Cross. The doctrine was proven. Medenine was that doctrine applied at industrial scale. The terrain made it possible. Medenine sat at the base of the Matmata Hills. Rocky high ground to the west, the sea to the east, and between them a narrow coastal strip that funneled any attacking force into predictable corridors. If you were in a Panzer, every route forward led through a bottleneck, and Montgomery put a gun at the end of every bottleneck. Over 500 anti-tank guns, 6-pounders in the forward positions. The new 17-pounders, capable of killing a tiger from over a mile, roughly 1,600 meters, covering the deeper approaches. Artillery batteries in reverse slope positions, pre-zeroed on every obvious armor corridor. Infantry dug deep, with mortars registered on every route. Then he pulled his own tanks back, behind the gun line, out of sight. Do not move, he told his armor commanders. Let the guns do the work. If you watched our story on Sidi Rezegh, the disaster in 1941, where British tanks charged into German guns and 5,000 men paid the price, you understand why that order mattered. For 2 years, the British instinct had been to counterattack with armor, chase the Panzers, meet them in the open. And for 2 years, that instinct had gotten men killed. Not this time. The night of March 5th was cold, 8 degrees Celsius, 46 Fahrenheit, after sunset. The gun crews slept in shifts beside their weapons. No fires, no radio traffic. 500 crews sitting in holes in the ground, watching the clock. Some of them had been at Snipe. They knew what morning would bring. Rommel launched Operation Capri at 0600 hours on March 6, 1943. 3 divisions, the 10th Panzer, 15th Panzer, and 21st Panzer, rolled forward with approximately 140 tanks. It was the largest armored force Rommel had committed to a single attack since Gazala, nearly a year earlier. The morning was cold, visibility decent, scattered haze burning off as the sun rose. The Panzers advanced in textbook formation. Tank companies spread wide, reconnaissance elements probing ahead. They expected to find the British still organizing their defenses. They found something else entirely. The first wave hit the gun line at 0628 hours. The 6-pounders opened up at ranges under 1,000 meters, about 1,100 yards. Within 4 minutes, the 6 tanks were burning. The Germans couldn't see what was killing them. The guns were dug into scrapes barely visible against the desert floor, camouflage netting breaking up the outlines. By the time a Panzer commander spotted a muzzle flash, the round was already in the air. Paper doesn't shoot back. The desert did. The radio traffic from the German side, fragments preserved in divisional after-action summaries, tells the story. Pack front, bearing 180. Range unknown, request smoke. Sugar 3, this is Sugar Actual. We're taking fire from multiple positions. Cannot identify source. All units halt, halt, halt. They couldn't halt. The ground behind them was already under artillery fire. Montgomery had registered every withdrawal route, every piece of dead ground that retreating tanks might use for cover. The Panzers that tried to reverse drove straight into pre-planned barrages. In 25-pounders walked shells across the desert floor with mechanical precision. Let that sit for a moment. The Germans were attacking a position designed specifically to kill them. Every fold in the ground, every depression, every logical piece of cover. The British had mapped it, measured it, and pointed a gun at it. The 15th Panzer Division's war diary records the time as 0714 hours, when the division commander requested permission to withdraw. The request was denied. Rommel, monitoring from a command post in the rear, ordered a second assault. The second wave came at 0800 hours. It fared worse than the first. The British gunners had found their rhythm. A trained 6-pounder crew could put out 3 aimed rounds per minute. The Panzers were silhouettes against the morning sky, advancing into the rising sun. Range estimation was unnecessary. The guns were pre-zeroed on landmarks the crews had memorized the day before. An officer with the 2nd Royal Horse Artillery described it later as target practice with incoming fire. The incoming fire hit almost nothing. The gun positions were too well concealed, too deeply dug. German tank guns fired at shadows, at suspected positions, at anything that might have been a threat. Most rounds went high, went wide, went into empty desert. At Tajerak Bir, a group of Panzers managed to find a gap. They pushed through, engines screaming, trying to flank the gun line. No, they found the Scots Guards. The guardsmen didn't run. They didn't call for tank support. They traversed their guns and waited. One account from the 2nd Battalion describes letting a Panzer close to 200 yards, about 180 meters. 200 yards. A 30-ton machine driving at you, machine guns aimed at your face, and you sit there with your hand on the firing lever, waiting for the order. Wait. Wait. Fire. The turret blew clean off. The 21st Panzer Division, on attacking from the south, made the deepest penetration of the day, nearly 2 kilometers over a mile, into British lines. For an hour, it looked like a breakthrough, the kind of rupture that Rommel had exploited a dozen times before. But the farther they advanced, the more exposed their flanks became. They'd pushed past the first gun line, straight into the second. The British had prepared defense in depth. Breaking through one position just meant entering the kill zone of the next. The fresh batteries that hadn't fired all morning opened on the penetrating column. The hidden British armor finally moved, but only to seal off the breach. Montgomery still wasn't going to let Rommel bait him into a tank versus tank fight. The tanks stayed hidden. The guns did the work. Around 1000 hours, the Luftwaffe tried to intervene. Stukas appeared over the battlefield, screaming down toward the British gun lines. Usually, this is where infantry breaks. When the British troops stood up in their slit trenches and cheered. They weren't cheering the Germans. A squadron of Spitfires had dropped out of the sun onto the Stukas' tails. Rommel ordered a third push at 10:15 hours. This one barely made it within 800 meters, about 875 yards, of the British line before breaking. The surviving tanks reversed through smoke and dust, crews half blind, radio nets jammed with calls for support that no one could answer. The shooting sputtered out around 1100 hours. The sound faded, the dust settled. The morning went quiet. The field in front of the British positions looked like a scrapyard. Burned-out hulks scattered across the scrub, some still smoking, a few with hatches open where crews had bailed out and run. The numbers came in over the following hours. Reconnaissance patrols crept forward once the Germans had pulled back, counting wrecks, marking positions. 52 German tanks destroyed. That's not a typo. 52. The exact same number the 2nd Rifle Brigade had claimed at Snipe 5 months earlier. Only this time, it happened in a single morning, with almost no British casualties. The 8th Army's losses for the entire engagement: 130 men killed and wounded, 1 anti-tank gun destroyed. No tanks lost. Montgomery hadn't committed any. There's a report from a crew in the 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats, who were positioned in reserve behind the gun line. They spent the entire day drinking tea and watching the battle through binoculars. They never started their engines. They didn't have to. The Germans lost over 600 men. Boys from Bavaria, from Hamburg, from Berlin. Men Rommel couldn't replace. Not the equipment, not the crews, not the years of experience those men carried. Veterans who had survived Tobruk, Gazala, the long retreat across Egypt, killed in a futile charge against a position that was waiting for them before they'd even started their engines. 52 tanks, 600 men, a morning that broke the Afrika Korps forever. And nobody talks about it. They don't make movies about 500 guns sitting in the dirt waiting. That's not how the war gets remembered. But it's how the war was won. Yeah, we cover one of these every week. The stands that decided everything and then got buried in the footnotes. If you've watched this far, you already get it. We'll keep finding them. The surviving Panzers withdrew behind the Mareth line that afternoon. They wouldn't attack again. Rommel knew exactly what Medenine meant. The reports he sent back to Berlin in the following days carry a tone that's difficult to miss. Exhaustion. Frustration. The careful phrasing of a man who's stopped believing in what he's being asked to do. The enemy's defensive preparations exceeded all expectations. Our armored strength has been critically reduced. The tactical situation does not favor further offensive action. What he didn't write, but what everyone understood, was simpler. The Afrika Korps was finished as an offensive force. They could defend, they could delay, but they would never drive the British back again. Now, the entire strategic picture had inverted. Rommel had built his legend on speed, on aggression, on the sudden strike that caught enemies off balance. At Medenine, he'd attacked an enemy who knew he was coming, knew where, knew when, and had spent weeks preparing the perfect response. He'd walked into a trap, and he'd known it was probably a trap, and he'd attacked anyway because doing nothing meant slow strangulation. Maybe he was just a man who only knew how to do one thing, attack, and couldn't stop doing it, even when the logic fell apart. The Desert War had changed. Rommel hadn't. 3 days later, on March 9th, a small Fiesler Storch aircraft taxied onto a runway near Sfax. A man walked across the tarmac. He was wearing a leather coat against the morning chill. He looked older than his 51 years. Gaunt, sun-weathered, defeated. He climbed into the plane without fanfare. There was no guard of honor. No parade. He was flying back to Germany to meet Adolf Hitler, to request permission to evacuate the Afrika Korps, to save what remained of his 230,000 soldiers before the inevitable collapse. Hitler refused. He ordered Rommel to take medical leave instead. The official reason was health problems. The real reason was that Hitler didn't want a general talking about evacuation. Rommel never returned to Africa. The army he built, the legend he created, he left it all behind in the Tunisian mud. Here's what most accounts leave out. The British didn't win because of ultra alone. Intelligence helped, obviously. Knowing the enemy's plan before he executes it is an extraordinary advantage. But Montgomery won because his army had finally learned how to fight Rommel. Sidi Rezegh had been a disaster. British armor charging into German guns, 5,000 casualties. Snipe had been a desperate stand, brave, bloody, improvised. Medenine was neither. It was a professional army executing doctrine with complete discipline and absolute confidence. The 500 guns weren't a trick. They were the lesson of 2 years of learning, refined and applied by men who'd paid for that education in blood. If your family served in North Africa, any side, if there's a letter in a drawer somewhere, or a story your grandfather told once that nobody else in the family remembers, leave it in the comments. You'd be surprised how many details in these videos came from someone who was just listening. Rommel told Hitler the war was already lost. No one listened. They never did. The Desert Fox's war in the sand was over. It started with a disaster at Sidi Rezegh, where British armor charged into German guns and 5,000 men paid the price. It turned at Outpost Snipe, where 19 guns and 300 men proved that determined gunners with 6-pounders could gut a Panzer division. And it ended here, at Medenine, where 500 guns waited in silence for a man who had finally run out of tricks. The 230,000 soldiers he left behind had 67 days. 67 days until Tunisia fell, until the largest Axis surrender outside Stalingrad. But that collapse, that's a story we haven't told yet. Some of them are still in the Tunisian sand.